As the government shoves through new Northern Ireland legacy legislation, many veterans, victims' families and ordinary people are watching this with a mix of anger and fatigue, and they're not getting straight answers. In today's podcast, we examine one operator and his approach, Jonathan Powell, and what that approach produces in the real world. Powell, who was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff from 1994 to 2007, and one of the architects of the negotiations with the IRA to end the armed insurrection, is now National Security Advisor at Number 10. Powell positions himself as a contemporary interpreter of Machiavelli, both in title and intent. In fact, his book is literally titled The New Machiavelli, which is marketed as a modern reworking or counterpart to Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince for today's political leaders. Our guest today is former Para-Lieutenant Colonel Simon Barry, who served in Northern Ireland and has been tracking the legislation closely. He has strong views on where it's heading, what it means for those who served and those who suffered, and on Powell's role in it all. This is the justiceforveterans.uk One More Mission podcast. Simon, thanks for joining us. Let's start with some key points, beginning with the role of Jonathan Powell. Why is Jonathan Powell the lens for understanding for what's happening now?
Basically, he was really the key player in the whole 1998 agreement process and so on, which was the Northern Ireland peace process. 27 years on, we are living with the effects of a peace process that hasn't necessarily delivered a fair and lasting peace on a basis that most people could understand. The fact is that he is now back in Downing Street and involved in all sorts of other things, but the impetus for what's going on with the Legacy Act repeal and so on is very much driven from Number 10. So he is part of Number 10, and therefore he is this continuing thread through it, and I think he therefore deserves a little bit more attention than he's had hitherto.
Some people would say that Powell is yesterday's man, but you're suggesting a different pattern here.
No, he's very much today's man. He's now the National Security Advisor. The government is preening itself on the international stage of peacemaking, peace brokering, based on the Northern Ireland peace process, of which Powell was a part, and putting it into the context of Gaza. And I think if people want to start looking around all these various wonderful things that we're claiming to be able to do, they need to unpick it a little bit and see what really, really happened. I think if you look deeply, and if the Israelis and even Hamas look deeply into the lessons of the Northern Ireland peace process, which most of us would now look back on with hindsight as appalling appeasement, you aren't going to get the Israelis to appease Hamas. You are not going to get Hamas to appease the Israelis. Therefore, touting yourselves as the ultimate peacemakers through appeasement isn't even going to start anywhere. You are just going to be ignored by the big superpower player, i.e. America, and you're going to be totally ignored by the two parties in the process, Hamas and Israel. So you're deluding yourselves, and you're trying to delude the international community if you think that what happened in Northern Ireland is a great way of bringing peace to the Middle East, because I would argue it certainly isn't.
What would you count as proof that you're wrong about his influence?
I think the basis of the Northern Ireland peace deal was appeasement, and it was appeasement of an enemy that ran an insurrection who had lost and actually didn't need to be appeased. But it looked good, and the spin, and this was obviously in the days of fantastic spin coming out of Whitehall and Downing Street. The spin was great. It looked really good. Everyone thought everybody was marvellous, and Nobel Peace Prizes were spoken about and so on. But actually, truth being the daughter of time, we can see now that it wasn't quite as clever as it was dressed up to be, and therefore it doesn't necessarily have, as a way of doing international business, a great amount of credibility with many potential players in many parts of the world. We're looking at it through the prism of Northern Ireland and where we are with it now, but we can equally look at it through the prism of the Middle East, as I've just said, and indeed China, where Jonathan Powell cut his teeth in the 80s on the Sino-UK agreement over the future of Hong Kong.
Okay, so let's look at what he does, how he operates, and the machinery involved, or perhaps I should say the machinations would probably be close to the point. Can you describe Powell's method in plain English? If he walks into a problem, what are his first moves?
That we'd all love to know, but I think one could deduce from his own writings, it is to use that old adage that when you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. And we all understand that. That kind of makes sense. But before you do that, you set the conditions so that you're talking peace, with what your best deck in your hand. That is not necessarily the way it pans out. The Hong Kong peace process, as it was, the agreement between the UK and the People's Republic of China to hand back the new territories, ended up being handing back the whole of Hong Kong Island, Kowloon Peninsula. The latter two were ceded to the UK in perpetuity. It was only the new territories that were subject to a 99-year lease. But in the end, the Chinese got it all. It was nicknamed, when I was in Hong Kong, as the Great Chinese Takeaway, because they had it all, and we put in a load of wonderful safeguards for one country, two systems, which everyone said, isn't this marvellous, and so on, and reassured some of the Hong Kongers, not all by any means, because the vast majority of Hong Kong Chinese had gone to Hong Kong to escape the cult of Mao and the Chinese Communist Party. They didn't want to see it coming back. And yet we kind of put some safeguards in place. I think Chris Patten, the last governor, may have a few words to say on that. But those safeguards now, the daughter of time again, have completely fallen apart, with total bad faith on the part of the Chinese, and the freedom and so on of Hong Kongers now is significantly less than it was 35 years ago. And to an extent, those who negotiated that deal, treaty, whatever, need to look back and ask themselves, is this really what they thought it was going to end up as? Because if it is, then they were being deceitful throughout.
A lot of these negotiations are done through back channels and quiet contact, and that's quite often defended as necessary. But what safeguards should exist when states start doing that with violent actors as they did in Northern Ireland?
I think the first thing has got to be a moral and ethical way of going forward. You can't go and sit down with a bunch of terrorists and gangsters and deal with them as if they are anything other than terrorists and gangsters, particularly when they're operating in a democracy. And if you forget that, then you forget the values and standards of the nation and arguably the government that you seek to represent. And indeed, the values and standards of those who have actually created the conditions through their own sacrifices to enable you to get there. Of course, you have to have back channels. And in massive conflicts, you've always had the Swiss and Swedes and people like that who have been a back channel to the enemy to maybe enable a sensible dialogue to take place. And we all understand that. Back channels are important. That is just a channel of communication, like anything. It's like picking up the phone, like talking on a radio. At the end of the day, it's what you say and what you do that is the most important thing. So the back channels are key, but it's what you say through the back channels that are even more important.
Where does pragmatism and rule bending begin? Where do you draw the line there?
Well, it's interesting. If you want to look at European history, there was a little bit of rule bending in Versailles in 1918, and people were quite nice and sort of a little more easygoing on the people who arguably started the whole thing. But where did that end us up? It ended up with a Second World War 21 years later. The result of that was unconditional surrender to make certain that this did not happen again. They did not rise again, and they did not constitute a threat to peace in Europe or world peace or whatever. Look at it through that lens, and you could say that actually, if you have beaten your terrorist enemy, they need to know they're beaten and they need to stay beaten, because that's how you keep the peace.
I don't think anybody would say that you cannot be reasonably accommodating and reasonably flexible. But I think the most important thing is when people have stuck themselves on the line to uphold the rule of law and to guard and look after the security of the vast majority of the population, that should not be negotiated away in any way at all. Because once people, and any policeman will tell you, what gets rewarded gets repeated. Some people, particularly in the sort of peace negotiation areas of life seem to forget that. And your terrorists just come back for more. And that is what has been going on since 1998. If you look at the process of 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed on Easter, as why it's known as a Good Friday Agreement, and that was April. But the IRA didn't really get all they wanted. But they knew that if they pushed a little bit harder, then the mood music of the British government's negotiators had obviously led them to believe that if they do something else and something harder, they will get what they want. And so, lo and behold, 29 people had to pay with their lives at Omagh, and also there were bombings previously between April and August to persuade the British government to surrender almost the last of its principles of law and order and give pardons and comfort letters to terrorist murderers. And so that's what happened. And when you do that, you kind of devalue everything that you say that you stand for, because you don't stand for the rule of law anymore if you're prepared to compromise it in that way. And therefore, you can't go around the world strutting on the world stage saying that you do that. You have to dress it up as some sort of really clever form of diplomacy, which appeasement actually isn't. And I think we need to remember that he got a bad name of Neville Chamberlain, but Neville Chamberlain had no choice. He had to appease out of necessity to buy us time to be able to stand up to an appalling enemy. This appeasement is done more out of ideology, I would argue, than it is out of the national interest.
Let's focus a bit on the moral framework here. I want to look at the story that Powell perhaps tells himself, and certainly what he sells to voters. Does Powell's approach treat the state and these armed groups as moral equivalents?
Well, I think there's always a frisson when you're sort of consorting with the bad guys and you come from a background where people like that look interesting in films and things like that. And there's a sort of closet romanticism in some people that that's all wonderful stuff. And you tend to fall into their propaganda images of what they are, whereas in reality, what they are gangsters, terrorists, murderers, apologists, therefore, and so on. So you have that slightly different view of how you approach things. And so therefore, where do you start from? Do you start from need to uphold the principles for which this whole campaign was fought in the first place? Or do you go to well, I think we can all look jolly good at the end of this by a bit of spin and a bit of whatever, and all walk away? And so I do believe that particularly Jonathan Powell, in his own words, in his own book, felt some sort of, I don't know, frisson dealing with McGuinness and Adams. He even invited them to his wedding party. And there was a time where he mentions that everyone was really upset. In fact, he gave the slip to his security detail at the airport when he flew over from London for some meeting with the McGuinness and gang, or whichever members of that particular gang, and that he dodged the security and went without any form of security to have this meeting. Well, of course, he would be perfectly safe because, frankly, if you look at it from the other side, if Jonathan Powell is bending over backwards to give you what you want, are you going to prejudice that by doing anything to him? Certainly not. He's pretty much singing from your script, so you'll certainly look after him. And although he sort of describes that as a bit of daring do on his part, I think it was nothing of the sort. I think he was extremely safe because he was effectively giving them everything that they wanted.
There's a sense in the way that you're talking that his talking to terrorists is somehow portrayed as moral courage, perhaps because it flatters the negotiators. I mean, who benefits from that sort of moral narrative?
I think a group of people who try and portray themselves as above the dirt and filthiness of having to confront these people head on, and that they're all a few layers above us, and that they can turn around and smile on the world stage, shake hands, and put themselves forward for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think it's fitting that the Nobel Peace Prize for this process actually went to John Hume and David Trimble, not to Tony Blair or Jonathan Powell, because I think those two men did a damn sight more than the other two men. But there is that sort of frisson that, look at me, I brokered this, look at me, I brokered that. But as ever, as we said before, truth is the daughter of time. And what might look good on the press release next week can be pretty rancid a few years later when, thankfully, peace was a bit of an illusion. that looked good and was spun particularly well. Don't forget, the late 1990s was the heyday of the spinners in Tony Blair's administration, and so they would have thoroughly enjoyed doing all this. But the substance is what really needed to be looked at, and one gets the impression that the substance and also the concerns of the majority of the people had to be, to an extent, trodden over to give the level of appeasement to the terrorists that they got. I mean, examples are flying of the Union flag, removing the crown from things, changing the name of the police force and all that sort of stuff. That was purely as appeasement to public insensitivities in a way that, frankly, the vast majority felt was probably unpalatable, but gosh, if it gave us peace, then maybe we have to swallow it. But after a while, people get fed up with swallowing stuff that's when it's just a one-way ticket, if you like.
When you talk about substance, a big part of that is the language that we use. How do you best describe the conflict? Terrorism, armed insurrection, civil conflict, the Troubles? What does Powell's preferred language do politically, do you think?
Well, if we look at where he's sitting right now, which is number 10 Downing Street, and number 10 Downing Street's talking about the Troubles all the time. And there's so many people who've said for many years, quite a lot recently, Troubles makes it sound like a bunch of football hooligans getting out of control and so on. This was an armed insurrection. And let's be honest, if the British Army hadn't gone there in the early 70s, it could have been total and utter civil war with all the bloodshed and misery that comes along with that. It was totally driven by the IRA. And so it shouldn't be couched in this sort of, I don't know, circumlocution of what it was. It was more than a set of troubles. It was a massive armed conflict. Thousands and thousands of people died. I put it to you that is not troubles. That is a lot worse. But the perpetrators of most of it, let's not forget they were loyalist terrorists, but they were very much as a reaction to what was going on from the Sinn Féin IRO, is that they were stopped. The only reason they spoke is because they had no choice. They had been beaten, and they had been beaten comprehensively. They were infiltrated. They were beaten when they came out to fight. The only thing that they could really do anymore was just blowing people up, women, kids, and shooting people in the back. That's the sort of level of gangster terrorism that you were dealing with. And so from a position of great strength, that conditions having been set by the army, the police and security services and so on, and the resilience of a lot of the community, which we should not forget, you then get there with an extremely strong hand. And then, by the end of it, you've given away a lot of your national iconography and so on to pander to supposed feelings of hurt. And then you've given away a complete basis of the rule of law by pardoning terrorists and giving people comfort letters, over 300 comfort letters. Not one soldier got a comfort letter, not one policeman got a comfort letter, but over 300 suspect terrorists got comfort letters. And you turn around on the world stage and hope someone's going to write an article comparing you to Henry Kissinger. So, yes, let's look at it through that particular lens. It was not very impressive, was it?
I wonder at times if an ordinary soldier broke the rules for the greater good, would the system protect them in the way it protects the terrorists?
Well, let's just look at the reality. No, and we can see that from what's going on right now. And let's look at terrorists. Let's look at Niccolò. So Niccolò, 8 terrorists went out, and some of them, a few of us know, people like James Liner and so on, who are, this earth is a lot better off without him around. They went off to murder and destroy a police station and so on. They were killed. They had gone out to kill, but it didn't quite work the way they wanted it to work. They'd gone out to murder, and they were stopped and they were killed in the process in a huge firefight. And now, Hilary Benn, the Secretary of State, recently announced that because of something to do with the perceived human rights of one of the attempted murderers, that there would be another inquest into this whole thing with all sorts of people who don't understand anything about insurrection, terrorism, armed conflict, and so on, opining to pander to the Republican agenda. And that was a week after that Dan Jarvis, the security minister, stood up in Parliament to say that there would be no reopening of any inquiry into the Birmingham pub bombings, which killed 21 young people who were totally and utterly innocent. So there is absolutely no moral equivalence. And yet the way this government is performing right now, it almost defies belief that the interests of those who went out to kill and murder are being preferred for whatever political purpose to those people who on the mainland of Britain were not involved in this conflict at all, but whose children paid their lives for Republican terror. It just doesn't stack up, frankly.
Can you tell me a few downstream consequences of Powell's approach that still shape policy today?
I think the first thing is, and I think we've mentioned it already, is the most important thing is the two-tier system with regard to the justice and the way people are treated. So you have the pardons, the comfort letters and so on. The terrorists, you elevate them above the people who were fighting them. The terrorists were going out there to kill. That's all they did. That's all they were interested in for whatever reason. They operated like a bunch of gangsters, and that's because they were. And yet, loads and loads of them were given it's all right, no hard feelings, off you go. And yet those who risked their lives, and let's face it, over 700 soldiers and over 300 policemen were killed doing this, to stop that, are treated with no favour whatsoever, in a totally lower tier. So those who served the interests of peace and the interests of the vast majority of people and so on, and those who had a duty to keep people safe, are frankly almost discarded in the process of appeasing a bunch of terrorists. The upshot of all this is people will look and they will see that actually crime pays. People were rewarded. You have the ludicrous situation where on the Police Oversight Committee in Northern Ireland, you have Jerry Kelly, a man who's a convicted bomber who bombed Downing Street in which a person died. And this guy is sitting on the Police Oversight Board. And I wonder what information he's picking up and wonder where that information is going. Working for people who had nothing more in their hearts than to destroy the police in Northern Ireland is now sitting up there. And if that isn't quite bizarre, I'd like to know what is. So in terms of where you want to look at when you're strutting your stuff on the world stage, a lot of people look beyond the spin. I'm afraid these days people do their due diligence and so on. And when sort of smug people turn up and say, hey, we brought peace to Northern Ireland, there'll be a few people who go around and go, well, let's have a look and see how that really worked. You didn't necessarily bring total peace. You stopped conflict. You still left festering unhappiness in certain quarters, but because you have allowed the narrative to be taken control of by the people who actually we had to beat. And if you think that's going to impress, as I said before, the Israelis, Hamas, the Americans or anyone like that, then I think you are deluding yourself and before you're even attempting to delude them, and it's certainly not going to work. So in terms of our standing, it makes us look as if we are smug and self-delusional rather than anything else. And that doesn't really translate into solving other people's conflicts. I'm not saying that anybody else is doing a much better job, but I don't think we should pretend that we achieved something that was morally right, because I don't think we did.
So if Powell's fingerprints are on today's legacy approach, what can we expect to see?
Well, just moving on from that, and fun enough, starting where we all came in, or he all came in the Hong Kong thing. He is now a national security advisor, and his primary role is the security of our borders. That's not going very well, is it? Deterrence of possible conflicts. Well, let's have a look at that. Critical infrastructure, that could be argued as not being totally safe, and all the other bits and pieces that go into keeping a nation safe, including protecting it from hostile foreign agencies. So not only have we got the Hong Kong deal, we've now got the Chagos deal, which I think a lot of people aren't very happy about. And why? Who benefits? The Chinese. You have the collapse of a spy trial involving China. Who benefits? The Chinese. You have the whole issue about this new embassy just near the Royal Mint site and so on, with the Chinese throwing their weight around, and Jonathan Powell scuttling off to Beijing for quiet, under-the-radar conversations. Well, I think based on his past record of dealing with people who threaten him, I don't think Britain can say that
we've got somebody who's really got our back, can we?
What's the end state someone like Powell would be looking for? Is it closure at speed? Is it legal containment, international approval, narrative control?
I think more spin than substance. I think definitely international approval, lots of photographs. It's a bit like the Hilary Benn photograph with Simon Harris, and they're all standing there cheesy in front of the flags and so on. But don't dig too deep into the substance, because it's not going to look too good. And again, bringing it back to the whole Northern Ireland piece, if people were serious about doing the right thing, there are a number of ways in which they could show that. But because they are in hock to Sinn Féin IRA and to the Republic of Ireland, for reasons we can speculate, then they aren't necessarily going to do the right thing. They will say they will give us all the bromides that we all had to hear last month and so on. But when they've been given the opportunity to put their money where their mouth is, they have failed to do so. So that begs a whole raft of questions.
Where does the Republic of Ireland sit in this?
Says it's on the naughty step would be an understatement of massive proportions. Let's face it, there was a great term coined during the Vietnam War, active sanctuary, for all the places the Viet Cong could attack the Americans from. And the Republic of Ireland provided a very effective active sanctuary for 30 years. A large amount of the killings and bombings in Northern Ireland, and indeed on the mainland, were planned, conducted and supported from the Republic of Ireland. And in a place like community like Ireland, you can't go around building bombs, stealing cars, doing training with mortars, machine guns and all that sort of stuff without somebody noticing. It just doesn't happen. And yet they pretended that nothing was happening and thought that we were all going to believe it. And they thought that popping over to the States and drinking green beer in Boston in March every year was going to keep everybody happy. And to an extent, it probably did over there. But at the end of the day, they are complicit, most certainly, and possibly worse, in the killings in both Northern Ireland and the killings on mainland Britain. And the Semtex that came from Libya went through the Republic of Ireland. And so it ended up blowing up people in Britain, killing people in Britain, killing people in Northern Ireland. The Omagh bomb was a fully Republic of Ireland-based operation involving dozens of people stealing cars, modifying cars, getting stuff over bridges and all that sort of stuff. And, people know that evidence is pretty much out there in the old RUC archives or in the old RUC memory banks of some good men and true. So the Republic of Ireland has, shall we say, previous in this. And so this whole idea that they are going to become suddenly a wonderful bunch of people who are going to help deliver those perpetrators of murder and mayhem that have been in sanctuary in their country for 30 or 40 years in the interests of being a good neighbor. Anybody who believes that is in total and utter cloud cuckoo land. And so therefore, why are they doing it? And so I think a lot of us are now starting to think it's got nothing to do with the Northern Ireland thing. It's probably got a lot more to do with relationships with the EU and so on, because ever since the Brexit vote, the Irish government have been nothing if not hostile and difficult. And so maybe throwing a few people under the bus to get them back on side is a logical approach from people sitting in number 10.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you think you want to add, Simon?
Yeah, I think you asked about, how about things people can do to actually say that they are really interested in doing the right thing. Well, here's a few ideas. How about getting the Republic of Ireland to admit what pretty much everybody knows, that it did provide an active sanctuary for the IRA and the IRA's operations? And how about getting them to explain why 90% of the extraditions that the RUC asked for throughout the Troubles were refused, even though there was overwhelming evidence to prove that a successful prosecution was highly likely? Are we going to get a really full and transparent inquiry into the Omagh bomb, the bomb that got Jonathan Powell to finally cave in and give Sinn Féin IRA everything that they wanted, without any fudge to sort of pretend that the Republic wasn't involved? And a number of areas have been put forward for concrete, quick action. One was, comfort letters. If Al-Khan's is true to his word and says that they hold no legal status, then rescind them. We've asked them to do that already, but do it. Don't just say that they have no legal status, prove it. And they haven't done that yet. And then also, I think it would be very fair to redress the imbalance of, yes, we'll have an inquiry into Niccolò, but we won't have one into the Birmingham pub bombs, is that if the top 10 IRA outstanding atrocities were on a list that were to be investigated by whatever new authority comes in, and progress reports issued on a regular basis in a totally transparent way, people might actually believe in some of the stuff that is coming out to support this repeal of the Act. But if that doesn't happen, what is there to convince people that anything real is being done to get to the bottom of this and sort it all out? No, it's all spin, and it's all spin for a purpose. And I think we've worked out what that purpose probably is. But in the meantime, we are compromising our moral authority by yet again giving in to terrorists, while strutting on the world stage trying to say that we're really good at dealing with terrorism. And I think people really are laughing up their sleeves at this. And so do something firm, stand up for something and be seen to stand up for something. And guess what? You might get a bit more respect on the world stage.
Okay, just to finish off, if Jonathan Powell was sitting here with us in this room right now, what single question should he have to answer?
What were you thinking about when you were putting together the whole comfort letters pardons process, about that being viewed by the people who stuck their lives on the line to keep these people at bay and stop them doing more than they did, and in your own way instituting a two-tier system of dealing with terrorists that actually rewarded the terrorists more than it did the people who were putting their lives on the line to fight them? Can you please explain the morality of that to me? Because it goes beyond realpolitik, I would argue, and gets into a very difficult ethical and moral area, which the government now finds itself in for all the reasons that we've discussed over the last few minutes.
Simon, thanks again for your time. As always, insightful and to the point. Thank you. You have been listening to the One Last Mission podcast. To find out more, visit justiceforveterans.uk.